there's a history to my work, my understandings of biology. Way back, actually, in 1961, we published a number of papers that had nothing to do with biology, but had to do with the longitudinal course of longitudinal background to depression. And at that time, there had been very little psychological work on depression, but it seemed to me that just talking to patients, working with patients, that in general they had some kind of childhood trauma, and they had some precipitating trauma just prior to getting depressed, and then they got depressed. And so we did a study, a retrospective study, in which we looked at severe depressives, moderate depressives, and then psychiatric non-depressed control. And we found, interestingly enough, that there were twice as many of the severe depressed patients had lost a parent than the national average for that age group. And actually, there was a lot of orphanhood parenthood, because the population that we saw at that time had parents who had been in the World War I or had been in the epidemic following World War I, and then had lost their lives. So the first thing we did is we established that there was some kind of severe separation for the severely depressed patients. Then we wanted to see whether there was any kind of matching trauma that occurred prior to the depression. And indeed, one of my colleagues then did a study in which he showed that people who had separation trauma when they were children also had some kind of separation trauma prior to the depression. And so there was a congruency. So this was really quite an interesting finding, and we were quite happy with that. But I was always puzzled for the next, I mentioned the year, for the next 45 years, I puzzled over this fact that many people lose their parents in childhood, and they don't get depressed. And many people have severe separation, sometime during their adult life or adolescence, and they don't get depressed. But around 2003, 2004, there were a series of studies that showed that people who had a particular variant of the serotonin gene, the gene that improves the intake of serotonin, those were the people who were most likely to get depressed. So this was an important finding. However, the finding by the geneticists was not considered very remarkable, because this accounted for only 0.003% of the variance. However, if they put childhood trauma into the equation, and people had both, had become depressed and had childhood trauma, then that accounted for 10% of the variance. So it increased by 1,000-fold or more. So it was a combination then of having childhood trauma, and different studies show different types of childhood trauma. In some cases it was abuse, in some cases it was loss, some kind of serious loss, and in some cases it was some other type of serious problem. So each of the studies, though, did show a sensitivity that was imposed by the serotonin gene. But then we wonder, so that's, every time you solve a problem, you get a new problem, right? So then the question is, why did this serotonin gene confer specific sensitivity? So another group of people who were cognitively oriented examined people who had the serotonin gene, serotonin variant gene, and found that those people who had the variant also showed a negative cognitive bias. So these are children who are not depressed. They might have a depressed parent, but they're not depressed themselves. They have the serotonin gene and the serotonin variant, and they show this kind of negative bias. So now we have several things together. We have the occurrence of depression, we have the serotonin transporter gene variant, and we have the cognitive bias. However, there was no prospective study done. So another group of investigators showed that people who had this negative bias then were more likely to get depressed, provided they had some kind of trauma just prior to depression. So now we have several points. So we're able to fill in the dots. Now, all of you have heard things about dysfunctional attitudes, like if I don't do well in an exam, my parents will hate me, or everybody will look down on me, or if I'm not included in a party, then it means that I'm socially undesirable. So the next group of people, investigators, then looked at dysfunctional attitudes, and they showed that people had the serotonin gene, and they had the negative bias, and they had the dysfunctional attitudes, and they had some precipitating trauma, then got depressed. So we got a complete package. Now, I should say, for those who are really research-oriented, the serotonin gene isn't the only gene that can be involved. There are other genes. There are also protective genes. And if one has the protective gene and has the negative gene, the bias gene, they probably won't get depressed.